Oh, and Clara, opening night is tomorrow. Clara, was that a play that you're in? Remind us if it's opening night, or is it a musical thing? And Mary Poppins. All right, Lord, we pray for healing for Claire and that she would be able to perform well in this play. Amen. All right, well, let us know after the break how that goes. Speaking of break, obviously we're off next week. So as we talk about homework, realize that all this stuff is due in 2 weeks, right? Not next week, but the following week after Thanksgiving. Oh my goodness, that reminds me. Boy, I didn't get. Hang on just a second. Let me undo that because that means I've also have a special presentation for you at the end of class. So since it is Thanksgiving next week. Okay. Um, anyway, so let's talk about the homework. Chapter 7, so that's the next chapter. It's an open book quiz. Continue memorizing in the Declaration of Independence. The italicized text is your new text. Summarize the Constitution. Now, there's not new stuff to summarize at the end of Chapter 7. What this is saying is that if you didn't do it at the end of Chapter 6, because you already read Chapter 6, then please make sure to do it this week and then take the poll in the assignments tab to indicate that you've done it. And then read the article in the study place entitled Separation of Powers in the Bible and answer the questions at the end of the article. By answering them, you can put them in your notebook or you can, just maybe discuss it with your parents, but you don't have to submit them to me. Okay? All right. Any questions on any of that? Any questions? I did, Hannah, and I do have it. So I'll be getting that back to you at some point over the break. Christina, best to email me the question because I haven't checked, so I don't know if everybody has taken it or not. There may be one or two who haven't. So, yeah, so just go ahead and email, and then I'll take a look at whatever you want to talk about on that. Okay. See ya, Ella. All right, let's talk about Ella while she's gone. You know that Ella. Actually, she can listen to this on the recording. In fact, she's probably still in the room listening to us. Hey, Ella. All right. Let's get to our subject at hand. Today, we are going to talk about Mythbusters. Woohoo! You ever seen that show, Mythbusters? It's on cable. It's really good. I haven't seen it, I must admit, in quite a while. I don't know, a few years ago I used to watch it more often. My favorite show, though, was when they dealt with Pirates of the Caribbean. And, they were dealing with myths, busting or confirming myths. And one of the ones that they were dealing with was when Jack Sparrow and Will Turner are walking at the bottom of the lake holding a canoe or a boat type thing and breathing in the air pocket. And so the question was, could somebody really do that? Because everybody knows there is an air pocket caused by an upside down boat. So would they have been able to do that? And it was actually very interesting. By the way, it's not just Jack Sparrow, it's Captain Jack Sparrow. Let's make sure we get that right. Right? He always corrects people. Captain Jack Sparrow. But it was really interesting because they, after you watch it, you realize that would not have been possible. Do you know why? Why it would not be possible to do that? But you're thinking, wait a minute, of course you can breathe in the air pocket. So why is that not possible? It's not possible because it takes, and I forget what the specifics were, hundreds or thousands of pounds of pressure to pull the boat down to be able to walk along the bottom of the lake. So there is no way humanly possible that two people could hold that down because the boat wants to rise to the top. But anyway, then the show goes on in Mythbusters. They show you how they did it, how they filmed it. They did it with pulleys and train track type implements, and it's fascinating how they do it. But no, it would not be humanly possible for two people just to hold it down and walk along the bottom. So anyway, interesting show, but that's what we're going to be doing today. We are going to debunk some of the greatest myths of our time. Of course, I know whenever you talk about dispelling some of the greatest myths, people get really excited. Oh boy, is Mr. Pratt going to reveal whether Willie Nelson really smoked a joint on the roof of the White House? Or is he going to discuss whether Johnny Cash painted an entire hotel room black? Or, what about Elvis Presley's whereabouts? I mean, he's not dead, right? I mean, you've heard that one, I'm sure. Or how about for you baseball fans? Did Babe Ruth really point to the spot where he hit a home run? Like before he hit the home run? Well, so you guys may be thinking, I don't know, these are way before my time. But, sorry to disappoint you. I'm not going to be discussing whether these are fact or fiction. But like I said, all these are pretty old ones. So you may be interested in more recent rumors and myths, such as, and here's some things from your lifetime. Is it true that a plane really didn't hit the Pentagon on 9/11? I don't know if you've ever heard that one. Or Tom Brady's deflated footballs. Yes. How about that one? Yeah, they get even better. How about, is it true that President Bush and his father went fishing on the troubled waters of New Orleans in the aftermath of the Hurricane Katrina in 2005? Finally, this one got a laugh from me the first time it came out. Is it true that this was the last picture ever taken on the World Trade Center? Supposedly, the camera that took the picture was found in the rubble, and the film was developed, revealing this shot taken just seconds before the tower was struck by the plane. See the date stamp in the lower right-hand corner? Yeah, right. Actually, the plane came in at an angle. Well, sorry to disappoint you again. I'm not going to be putting these rumors to rest. You'll just have to investigate these on your own. But today what we're going to do is we're going to be looking at some of the greatest and most dangerous myths that plague our country. You can find them in our law schools, in our universities, in our public schools, in our state governments. Heck, you can find them in the minds of most congressmen, and even at 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue. By the way, whose address is that? 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue. Who works there? Or lives there, as the case may be. This is part of your government curriculum. Yeah, it's the president's house. And then, of course, you can find these myths on First Street at the U.S. Supreme Court. So the myths that I'm going to be tackling today involve how Americans actually view the Supreme Court. And what we're going to see is that what the average person today believes about the court is totally wrong. Totally wrong. At least using the Constitution and the Founding Fathers as a standard. So now here's the first myth that we're going to be looking at. This is the first myth. The Constitution is what the Supreme Court says it is. Charles Evan Hughes was the Supreme Court Chief Justice, and you might remember what he said. You read this in your chapter. He said, "We are under the Constitution, but the Constitution is what the judges say it is." mean, you just have to read that with a Nazi accent. You know, because I mean, think of all the dangers inherent in that statement. What is the problem with a statement like that? Why is that so dangerous? Tell your little sister hello, Hannah, and that I look forward to seeing her in class in years to come. Right? Because, I mean, I had your bro, Justin, right? Okay, say it one more time. What are the dangers in that statement? That's funny. They can say anything they want. Yeah. They can say anything they want about the Constitution. It basically allows justices to unofficially amend the Constitution without going through the amending process. Because after all, if the Constitution is what the judges say it is, then it doesn't matter if what they're saying is right or wrong. That becomes the new meaning of the Constitution. You know, unfortunately, most people today would agree with Chief Justice Hughes. A Hearst Corporation poll found that 59% of American people today say the court is the final authority on the interpretation of the Constitution. Now, that survey took place back in 1986, and I would have every reason to believe that the 59% figure has only gone up. And I'll tell you why I think that in just a minute. But again, myth number one is the Constitution is what the Supreme Court says it is. And so we're going to be talking about that. But then there's a second myth, and the second myth is this. Supreme Court decisions should be treated as settled law. Now, this one is extremely common. In 2005, there were confirmation hearings for Chief Justice John Roberts, and he was nominated for the U.S. Supreme Court by President George Bush. And one of his chief opponents was Senator Chuck Schumer of New York, who had this to say about it. Now that Roberts is nominated for a position where he can overturn precedent and make law, it is even more important that he answers a broad range of questions. Now notice Schumer's statement there, make law? I mean, what's the problem with that statement? What's the problem? I mean, who makes law? Does the court make law? Yeah. Roberts wasn't going for the legislative branch. He was nominated to be on the court. Now, Schumer cited abortion as one of those important questions Roberts would have to answer, and Roberts did have to answer that question. Unfortunately, he told senators in 2005, Roe versus Wade is the settled law of the land, and there's nothing in my personal views that would prevent me from fully and faithfully applying that precedent. So notice, this is the justice that gave us Obamacare. He was the deciding vote. He wrote the decision saying that Obamacare was constitutional, which was just scandalous. But we should have seen that there were problems in his thinking, because notice what he says, Roe versus Wade, the abortion decision, is the settled law of the land. Well, who settled it as the law of the land? Did Congress pass a bill? Did the president sign it into law? Who made it the settled law of the land? I mean, if you know anything about the history of abortion, it was purely done by the courts, by the Supreme Court, 1973. But is that who has authority to make law? In fact, attorneys and lawyers who have read that decision said it reads like legislation. I mean, it's really amazing. So, you know, here he's attributing congressional-like powers to the Supreme Court. I mean, why even have a Congress if you're going to let the Supreme Court make law? So that's a second myth that we're going to be looking at, that the Supreme Court can act as a pseudo-Congress. And so we'll look at that in a minute. But first, I should mention that there is a third myth that's out there, and this one's a little harder to disprove, but I will mention it anyway. just to expose you to these things. Like Clark Kent, Superman, it is believed by some that Supreme Court Justice Stephen Breyer also has an alternate identity because he has been caught on hidden camera as the cat in the hat. Now, this has still not been disproved conclusively, so I'm not going to spend any time on this one. I just throw that one out there for you just to expose you to it. You can believe what you want to about this one. I just report the news. Do not shoot the messenger, please. So we're not going to be dealing with this one, okay? We will just deal with the first two. Okay, so take a quick screenshot, and then you can Facebook that one. Anyway, so let's get back to the first myth. The Constitution is what the Supreme Court says it is. Is that true? Well, this book is taught all across the country in the public schools. It teaches that the Supreme Court is the branch that tells us what the Constitution means. And that's why I think that the 59% figure is much higher. I believe there's even more people today who think the Supreme Court gets the final say on what the Constitution means. But this wasn't the view shared by our founding fathers. Do you remember what Thomas Jefferson had to say about the three branches of government? The three branches of government. Let's see if, who is our first reader going to be? I lost my list. You guys are probably like, yay, because I didn't want to read anyway. Right? No, that's not a good attitude to have. What did I do with that? Oh, there it is. Found it. So, Clara, I believe you were first. Were you not? Let's see how your computer's doing, or if it's still acting up. Hey, Clara. Clara. Oh, man, we don't hear Clara, do we? Clara. No, we don't hear you. Or is it just me? Okay, no, other people don't either. All right, so Clara's computer really is. I hear her footsteps running out the door. Yeah, we did hear that, though, Clara. All right, Christina, you'll just have to pull double duty on this, okay? Hey, Christina, how are you?
Hey, I'm doing well. How are you?
Good. All right, so here we have a Jefferson quote. Jefferson quote goes 2 slides long. But I'll tell you what, we'll stop after each slide and just review what he said. So if you could read this for us and then just summarize it in your own words for us. Go ahead.
Alrighty. My construction of the Constitution is that each department is truly independent of the others and has an equal right to decide for itself what is the meaning of the Constitution in the cases submitted to its action. So he's saying that each branch of government has a right to interpret the Constitution for itself in the cases. What does it mean in the cases submitted to its action? Just the cases brought before it?
Right. So in other words, whenever there is a question on any particular issue, let's say it's the Alien and Sedition Acts, okay? So the courts get a case brought in before them. Maybe they feel that it's constitutional, and so they convict a person who was criticizing the government. But then you get Thomas Jefferson, who's president, and we'll talk about this later. He says, you know what? I don't think it's constitutional, so I'm not going to prosecute people. In fact, that's exactly what he said he wasn't going to do. So on any given issue, the 3 branches of government have an equal right to determine, okay, how does the Constitution apply to this particular issue or this particular bill or this particular law, okay? Because, all 3 branches will have a certain role in terms of how are they going to act. The legislature, you've got congressmen who may vote against the bill because they say it's unconstitutional. The president may veto the bill, or he may sign it, depending on whether he thinks it's constitutional. So that's what Jefferson's saying, that all three branches have an equal right to decide, is this constitutional or not. They don't just have to hear what the Supreme Court has said. Does that make sense?
Mhm.
All right. Now, here's the second slide. Why don't you go ahead and take that away?
The opinion which gives to the judges the right to decide what laws are constitutional and what not only for themselves in their own sphere of action, but for legislature and executive also in their spheres, would make the judiciary a despotic branch.
So what is he saying, Christina? If you allow the Supreme Court to get the final say and tell the other branches, here's what the Constitution says or means about this particular law or bill, if we only have to follow what the court says, what's the problem? Oh, okay, go
Sorry,
ahead,
I was
Christina.
thinking I was done. Um, so what he's saying is that the judiciary would be, would be in charge of everything. It could make all the decisions because it's it has, the law in its hands. It can twist it however it likes, so it can control both the legislature and the executive.
Okay, very good. So, basically, I mean, you see those last two words, right? Despotic branch. It gives them way too much power, which is what Christina was pointing out. To say that the Supreme Court is the ultimate umpire who can decide what the Constitution means for the other branches of government would turn any given 5 men and women on the Supreme Court, in other words, a simple majority of its 9 members, it would turn them into a despotic branch. And that's what Jefferson is saying. If the court is allowed to become the final authority, if it's allowed to become the only one that can decide what the Constitution means, then who becomes the ultimate human authority? Well, the answer is the Supreme Court becomes the ultimate human authority, because it can then easily substitute its opinion over and above what the Constitution says. That view, again, basically gives 5 people the power to unofficially amend the Constitution. After all, if the Supreme Court judges are the ultimate umpires, then who can question them? Who can overrule them? Speaking of umpires, during his confirmation hearings, Justice John Roberts said that judges are like umpires. Umpires don't make the rules, they apply them. And that statement's not bad as far as it goes. The Constitution and the Congress set the rules which judges should apply. I mean, think of it in terms of a football game. If one team is winning by a huge amount, the referees on the field aren't allowed to change the rules. I mean, imagine if one team is getting trounced, and they say, the refs get together and say, this game's getting out of hand. So now, when the losing team, when they have the ball, we're going to give them 5 downs, 5 chances to make a first down, not just 4. And if they score a touchdown, let's make it 10 points instead of 7. I mean, that would be outrageous, right? Referees can't change the rules. They can't widen the field for the losing team when they have the ball, to help them score. They can't do those kinds of things. They have to apply the rules fairly to both sides. So, this analogy to judges being like umpires is actually a good analogy. Now, where the comparison breaks down is when you start looking to the justices to be the ultimate umpires, where they can never be overruled. I mean, even in football, they have video replay, right? And refs do get overruled. But in Washington, giving one small group of people the ultimate power can be dreadful. Take baseball umpires, for example. Like football, we rely on them to make the final call, close plays at the plate, calling balls and strikes. We rely on the men in black to make these tough calls. You couldn't play a game without them. And even when they mess up, we still keep going back to them to make the final calls. And yet sometimes, boy, do they mess up bad. Now, none of you probably remember the 1985 World Series. But here's our quiz for today. Today it's a baseball quiz, although it does apply to what we're talking about. But look at the picture, and I'm going to ask you to make the call. I'll count to 3 and see what you guys think. But here, quite simply, I'm not going to make any editorial comments on this. This is a play at first base. You look at this play and tell me, do you think the runner is safe or out? Is the runner safe or out? So look at that carefully. Make your determination, and then here we go. 1, 2, 3, hit enter. Some of you jumped the gun there, but that's okay. All right, we finally got a safe. Jeremiah. Nice. Well, Jeremiah, the first base umpire agreed with you and called him safe. Yes. Actually, it's kind of hard to tell from the picture, but yes, the first baseman's foot is on the bag. The first base umpire called the Kansas City runner safe at first base when, boy, he was beaten by like half a step. Yeah, how in the world could he be safe? Well, a lot of people ask that question. But here's the deal. This was a 9th inning play. Calling him safe gave the Royals, okay, that's a Royal runner, the extra runner they needed to score the winning run in the bottom of the 9th inning. So that was the 6th game of the World Series. That meant St. Louis had to wait one more game to try to win the World Series, but alas, the Royals won the 7th game. Had the Cardinals won this game that you're looking at, they would have been the World Series champion. Instead, the Royals ended up winning this game because of that blown call, and then they won the next game. So the Royals became the champions. If you were to Google 1985 World Series, you will see St. Louis wins it 4-3. Well, I tell you, that poor umpire. In fact, there's this picture. Don Denkinger got all kinds of death threats. Death threats, mind you, from Cardinals fans. They were ticked. Oh, yeah, people were mad. But you know, it's one thing to give baseball umpires the final say in making tough calls, although even now they've got video replay. Although sometimes, let's face it, even video replay can't overturn a call. So it's one thing to give those umpires the final say in making tough calls. I mean, some say baseball's just a game. I mean, come on. It's like, hello, it's just a game. But in Washington, D.C., the stakes are much, much higher when you're dealing with courts and people's lives. Giving one set of men and women the final authority to decide what the Constitution means can lead to horrible consequences. I mean, remember the Dred Scott case? Sometimes the court is dreadfully wrong. No pun intended. Well, actually, that's not true. It wasn't intended. But in that infamous, yes, infamous 1857 decision, the Supreme Court basically ruled that blacks are not entitled to the same rights guaranteed other Americans. It was a horrid decision. Or how about FDR's decision to incarcerate more than 100,000 innocent people in the 1940s just because they were of Japanese descent? Supreme Court gave FDR the green light. That was another blown decision. Or how about, now this is more recent, the Kelo decision from 2005. I love the meme that I found on the internet about this. Say hi to your new landlord, that is the Supreme Court. Say goodbye to your property rights. Because according to this decision, this Supreme Court decision, local government can take your land so that somebody paying higher taxes on the land can own it. Horrendous decision. Although, as an aside, this is something that's pretty cool. As of 2005, several states had passed laws to interpose themselves and block the court's interpretation in their states. You know, we've talked a lot about interposition. Here's another example. Several states interposed themselves, blocked the court's decision. As of 2 years later, as of 2007, 42 states, 42 states. Yes, that is almost all of them. although when the president was running for his first election in 2008, he said that he'd been to all 57 states. There's not quite that many states. But 42 out of 50 states had enacted some type of reform legislation in response to the Kelo decision. So that's pretty impressive. But here's the point. Judges ignore the Constitution. Judges ignore the law. The judges who sit on the Supreme Court are human just like everybody else. So when, not if, when the court makes a bad decision, should it have the ability to force the president and Congress to obey it? Well, the founding fathers didn't think so. Take Alexander Hamilton. Here's Hamilton's quote. Let me have Ella. We'll have Ella read this one. Hey, Ella, how are you?
I'm good. How are you?
Good. All right. This is going to be 2 slides long. This is from Federalist Paper 78. So if you would read and, kind of take note of what he's saying, because at the end I'll have you kind of put this in modern day English for us, okay? All right, go ahead and read this for us, please.
All right. The judiciary has no influence over either the sword, the executive, or the purse, the legislature. No direction either of the strength or of the wealth of society, and can take no active resolution whatever. It may truly be said to have neither force nor will, but merely judgment. It must ultimately depend upon the aid of the executive arm, even for the efficacy of its judgments.
Okay, any clue what Hamilton's saying there, Ella?
So it's kind of just like saying, you kind of have to depend on the executive branch of government, but you should also have to be able to work independently. It's just judge. You can't force these laws into action. You just kind of get to decide what it says, but then the executive end of it has to enforce it all.
Okay. And righto about the executive department. Thank you for that, Ella. Yeah, because he's saying the courts can't force Congress or the president to do anything. I mean, the courts can give their opinion on a law, but the courts can't force the other branches to follow or adopt their opinion. In fact, Hamilton's point's even more emphatic because he says the courts are totally reliant upon the executive branch to carry out its opinions. And I think that's what Ella was pointing out too. And by the way, while it's not listed here, although we did see this a couple weeks ago when we were reading the debate between Jerry Nadler and Hostetler, and Hostetler quotes Hamilton, Federalist number 78. Hamilton goes on to point out that the judicial branch is the weakest of the 3 branches. Because of this, because it can't force the other branches to do anything, it has no force, only judgment, which is what you see him saying there. So it's really the weakest of the 3 branches. Almost to a man, the founders did not want any branch of the federal government to become supreme over the others. To give one branch this kind of power would have been like going back to a kingship, the kind of thing that they had gotten rid of in 1776. So some say then, well, what does it mean then that the Supreme Court is a supreme court if it's not supreme over the other branches? Okay, good question. I'm glad you asked that. The Supreme Court is supreme over all the other courts. The Supreme Court is not supreme over the other branches. So where did we get the idea that the Supreme Court gets the final say on what the Constitution means? Where did we get that idea? Well, the answer is not found in the Constitution, but in judicial opinions that have evolved over the years. And really it started with the Marbury versus Madison decision in 1803. And even then, it's not found there, but in the reinterpretations of Marbury versus Madison. Now, you all read about this in the book. And by the way, let's see, Ella was making a comment about Alaska, Hawaii. So I said he hadn't been. Yeah, the thing is I think you were talking about Obama's 57. If you add up all our territories, even that doesn't add up to 57. So nobody's really sure where he got that number. But anyway, um, you read about Marbury versus Madison in the book, which started with a dispute between John Adams and William Marbury on the one hand, and Thomas Jefferson and James Madison on the other hand. And if you remember what happened in this case, the Supreme Court ruled that a particular congressional law was unconstitutional. And Chief Justice John Marshall correctly understood that the courts were one of three co-equal branches of government, all of them under the Constitution. And he understood that neither the Congress nor the President could force judges to rule in a way that is contrary to our highest charter, to our Constitution. So just to make this clear, Marbury versus Madison involved a case where the Congress had passed a law forcing the courts to take certain action. So the court looked at that requirement and said, that's unconstitutional, you can't force us to do that. Remember, three independent branches of government, each has a duty to interpret the Constitution for itself and decide whether is this constitutional or not. So the court analyzed the law and declared that in its opinion the law violated the Constitution. Well, that was their authority to do that. But what has happened since then, I can only compare to what has happened to the First Amendment. Because this case, Marbury versus Madison, is to the separation of powers what the separation of church and state is to the First Amendment. This is what I mean. Just as there is no separation of church and state in the First Amendment, there is also no judicial supremacy in Marbury versus Madison. Nowhere in the case does Chief Justice Marshall ever elevate the court to a higher status above the other two branches of government. Okay? Marshall, the Supreme Court Chief Justice, he did favor judicial review where the courts issue their opinions on the constitutionality of legislation, but he did not favor judicial supremacy where the court issues a ruling and then all the other branches of government are forced to adopt the court's views. Does that make sense? I mean, hopefully that made sense to you in the chapter. Hopefully that's making sense now. Because look at what Chief Justice Marshall said elsewhere. He said, rather than impeaching a judge every time you disagree with his opinion, I think an appellate jurisdiction in the legislature allows for a reversal of those legal opinions deemed unsound by the legislature. So you see what he's saying. First of all, I kind of like the impeachment of justices. You could see why a judge might argue against it. But notice what he's saying. Hey, Congress, if you don't like the court's opinion, okay, just pass a law reversing it. That's what he means an appellate jurisdiction. You can appeal something that the court has done to the legislature. Well, how do you do that? The Congress just simply says, hey, let's take a look at that court decision. That's not right, so we're going to pass a law that says this is what the Constitution means. This is how the Constitution applies in this situation. Abortion is not legal. It is not constitutional. Congress could actually say that because there is an appellate jurisdiction in the legislature, in the Congress. It is really significant that Chief Justice John Marshall said this statement here, because Chief Justice John Marshall is the one that people appeal to, because he's the one that wrote Marbury versus Madison. People appeal to him to say, oh, the Supreme Court gets the final say on what the Constitution means. Well, first of all, Marbury versus Madison doesn't say that. And then you've got statements like this where he says, look, you can appeal, you can basically, the Congress can step in and say and reverse what the court has said. So that's Chief Justice Marshall, the guy who handed down Marbury versus Madison. See, it's important to understand that all three branches take an oath to uphold the Constitution. Now, I realize a lot of them do it with their fingers crossed, right? But the Congress and the President don't take an oath to follow the Supreme Court. They take an oath to follow the Constitution. So if they think the Supreme Court is out of line with the Constitution, then don't they have to side with the Constitution? Absolutely, right? Give me some examples where presidents disregarded the Supreme Court because they realized that courts only issue opinions and not laws. Can you, from chapter 6, do you remember some examples where presidents didn't follow the courts? They said, well, the court made their opinion, but I've got a different opinion of what the Constitution says, and I'm not going to follow the court opinion. Can you think of some examples? I already gave you a sneak preview for one of them here in class in answer to Christina's question earlier. But what are some of those examples? How carefully were you reading your chapter 6? There's at least 3 examples, 3 very notable examples of presidents disregarding Supreme Court opinions. What are they? And they disregarded them because they realized that courts issue opinions excuse me, and not laws. Courts only issue opinions, not laws, so presidents are free to disregard their opinions. What are some of those examples? Come on, put your cereal down. Let's go, folks. You had these in chapter 6. Clinton is mentioned in chapter 6, and actually you're right. That is an example. Now, I wasn't thinking of the Clinton example because what he did was actually overturning a good court decision, but you're absolutely right. That is an example. But let's go even more historic. Let's go 1800s. So thank you. At least one person read the chapter. No, 2 people. Ella, yes, Lincoln. Lincoln's an example. Hang on to that example. We'll get to that. That's going to be my 3rd example. So Lincoln, we've got 2 others. How about, oh, y'all should have gotten this one. Like I said, I gave you a sneak preview. With the Alien and Sedition Acts. Remember, okay, the Alien and Sedition Acts basically punished people for criticizing the government. Yes, Jackson was the other one. Good, Hannah. And so remember what Jefferson did in regard to this law. First of all, where the courts had convicted people and sent them to jail for criticizing the government, guess what Jefferson did? He pardoned them. But wait a minute, the courts had already spoken. The courts had said that, had treated the law as constitutional. Doesn't matter. Jefferson pardoned them because he believed the law was unconstitutional. And in addition to pardoning people that were convicted under the law, Jefferson said that as president, he would not prosecute people who violated unconstitutional laws like the Alien and Sedition Act. So even if that law was on the books, he would refuse to prosecute. So there you see the separation of powers at work. Congress supported the Alien and Sedition Acts. The courts supported the Alien and Sedition Acts. Jefferson did not. And so Jefferson says, and he pardons people, and he says, I'm not going to prosecute people. Hannah mentioned Andrew Jackson. Yeah, this one's classic. He refused to carry out a Supreme Court opinion, simply saying, Chief Justice John Marshall has made his decision. Now let him enforce it. I don't know that he said it quite like that with that accent, but but that quote is his quote. You know, see, when the court has spoken, it's not the final word. we hear all this talk today that once a court speaks, people say, oh, you can't go against the court. You must respect the rule of law. Remember the debate with Jerry Nadler and Hostetler? That's what Nadler was saying, that you have to follow whatever the court says. That's the rule of law. But the founders believed that obeying an out-of-control court is not the rule of law. Boy, wouldn't it be great if presidents today or governors would say, like Fob James did, yeah, court, we heard you, but we're not going to follow your unconstitutional decrees. Remember that? I mean, what a great thing if presidents and governors would do that. Lincoln did that, and Ella brought up Lincoln. He understood this. For example, he recognized that he was not bound by the Supreme Court's Dred Scott decision. Notice what he says. I do not forget the position assumed by some that constitutional questions are to be decided by the Supreme Court. Okay, notice he's saying there, first of all, already people are starting to get this idea that the Supreme Court gets the final say. So he says, I recognize some people have that view, okay? But he goes on, he says, at the same time, the candid citizen must confess that if the policy of government upon vital questions affecting the whole people is to be irrevocably fixed, in other words, it can't be changed, by decisions of the Supreme Court, the people will have ceased to be their own rulers, having to that extent practically resigned their government into the hands of that eminent tribunal. I know that's kind of wordy and a mouthful. It's 1800 speak. But basically he's saying if the Supreme Court is the final authority on the Constitution, then to put it in modern words, then the court is the ultimate umpire, not we the people. Thus the court can essentially amend the Constitution on its own. And you can kiss the separation of powers goodbye. Why even have a Congress? You know, if the Supreme Court gets to make laws and, you know, decide, get the final say on everything. But again, notice that even in his day, people were already starting to say that, you know, the people wearing the robes get the final say on what the Constitution, on, you know, the final say on constitutional matters. But Lincoln disagreed with this, and he makes a good case against it. So all of this is debunking myth number one. Using the eyes of the Founding Fathers, using the Constitution, using several early presidents, the Supreme Court is not the final interpreter of what the Constitution says and means. All three branches have an equal right to interpret the Constitution for themselves. Right? So all three branches have that right. Now, that brings us to the second myth. So we've looked at the first one. Now looking at the second myth, here's the second one. Supreme Court decisions should be treated as settled law. Now we'll cover this quickly because in a sense we've already been discussing this point to a great extent. But take a look at the Supremacy Clause. You might remember the Supremacy Clause is Article 6, Section 2. This Constitution and the laws of the United States, which shall be made in pursuance thereof, and all treaties made, or which shall be made under the authority of the United States, shall be the supreme law of the land. So quite simply, what are the three things that are the supreme law of the land? What three things are supreme? The Constitution, laws made in pursuance of the Constitution, and treaties. Very good. Notice what's missing here. Supreme Court opinions. Supreme Court opinions are not the supreme law of the land. See, the only authority for making laws is in Article 1 of the Constitution, and that power is given to Congress. The judges are bound by the supreme law, that is, constitutions or laws that are constitutional. Judges are bound by the supreme law. They don't make the law. That's the very nature of judicial power, and we looked at this a few classes ago. You might remember when Moses was really worn out, and he was talking to Jethro, and Jethro says to him, Moses, what are you doing? You know, you're wearing yourself out in the people. And remember what Moses said? Whenever the people have a dispute, it is brought to me, and I decide between the parties and inform them of God's decrees and laws. Notice, Moses was a law teller. He was not a judicial activist imposing his own ideas. He was telling them what the law was. That's what a judge does. They don't come up with the law. Yeah, they're like the middleman. They just repeat what the law is. You know, usually it's a good idea for judges to use the laws from their own country, right? But what you see even now happening, and this is horrid, is that U.S. judges are looking to foreign laws to help them decide cases. Yeah, they look to foreign law. Consider a case from 2005. A 17-year-old killed an elderly woman, tied her up, and threw her off a bridge. I mean, this was a horrid case. This happened in Missouri, so Missouri sentences this 17-year-old to death. But because he wasn't 18, and because other countries think it's barbaric to execute kids who are under 18, the Supreme Court cited those other countries' laws to say Missouri couldn't put this kid to death. He was no kid. He was a thug. I mean, is that not amazing? I mean, that's awful. Not only is this a horrible decision, I mean, once you start down this road, you could use foreign laws to prove any point you wanted to make. I mean, think about how dangerous that is. If we go down this road, just think of where we might end up. How about forced abortions? I think the Chinese are getting away from this, but for many years they performed forced abortions. You know, so should our judges look to China for justifying this in the United States? Or how about euthanasia? You know, the killing of the elderly. I mean, the Dutch think this is a great idea. They do it, so we could justify that here by pointing to them. Or how about cracking down on political dissent? You know, Fidel Castro in Cuba doesn't allow free speech, so we could justify banning free speech here in this country by pointing to Cuba. Or how about limiting firearms to just the police or to gun clubs? That's what they do in England. Or, you know, we could make our police wear those cool fuzzy hats. Could at least do that, right? But see, you could justify anything you want by looking to other countries. So when the Supreme Court ignores our laws and ignores the Constitution, what are we to do? What do we do when the court gets out of control and starts considering itself a lawmaker? Well, the states can do something if the court has acted outside of its authority. I mean, we've talked about that, right? You know, the states can interpose themselves. In fact, the states got together and passed the 11th Amendment. That was one example of interposition. But also the president can ignore the decision, like Thomas Jefferson, Andrew Jackson, Abraham Lincoln. But there's another thing, too, that can be done, and this may sound trite, but it's not. If politicians are going to keep deferring to the court, Americans need to vote them out. We can't just let them pass the buck and wash their hands like Pontius Pilate and say there's nothing they can do, because they can. And if they won't, voters need to kick them out of office. You know, as you guys read in chapter 6, and Taylor brought this up, the Clinton example, the very liberals who always tell us that the Supreme Court gets the final word will themselves work to overturn the court when it goes against what they think. And that's what happened in 1995 when the Supreme Court struck down the gun-free school zones law. Liberals like New Jersey Senator Frank Lautenberg on the left and Bill Clinton on the right, they were outraged. So what did they do? Well, Lautenberg added an amendment to a spending bill that basically reauthorized the law. He just made a couple of changes to the original language, which had been struck down by the court, and then Congress sent it to President Clinton, and he signed it into law. So the gun-free school zones ban is law once again, even though the court struck it down. But wait a minute, why didn't those liberals say, wait, the court has spoken. We have to follow the rule of law. They didn't do that because they're hypocrites. They want us to blindly accept whatever the court says when it takes a position that is contrary to the Constitution and contrary to what our founders believed, when it's what they believe. But when the court actually gets something right, then these same liberals work through the Congress to overturn the court. I mean, that's the hypocrisy of this whole thing. So this shows that they know that Congress can overturn the Supreme Court. They know that that can be done. And there are many ways to overturn the court. One way, as we've discussed already, is that Congress can rein in the federal courts by defunding the president's ability to enforce one of their decisions. That's you see John Hostetler there. That's one of my few meetings that I had with him while he was in the Congress. But that's what he tried to do in regard to the Ten Commandments in the courthouse. And you know, this has been done on other issues as well. And we could actually do it on many other issues like prayer in public schools. Why couldn't the Congress say there's no money to enforce that ban imposed by the courts? Or reading the Bible in public schools. You know, the courts banned the reading of the Bible. Why couldn't the Congress say there's no money to enforce that? Or, you know, when the courts rule in favor of gun control or rule in favor of abortion, why can't the Congress step in and say, nope, no money to enforce that? Or, nope, the courts no longer have jurisdiction to hear those kinds of cases. That's actually in the Constitution. Congress has that authority. So that's what the Congress can do. That's what Congress and actually the president signing legislation into law, what they could do to overturn court decisions. Now, let's review this issue of Mythbusters. First question we asked was, did Willie Nelson smoke a joint on the roof of the White House? Well, we don't care whether he did or not. Myth number one was the Constitution is what the Supreme Court says it is. Ultimately, who is the human authority in this country? Who will decide what the Constitution means? According to what the Founding Fathers have said, or the Constitution says, yes, it's either we the people, or, as Jefferson and Madison said, if there's a controversy between the states and the feds, since the states were the original parties to this compact, the states get to decide. Now, you recognize that's not the majority view today, but it was the Founding Fathers' view. So yeah, either the states or the people will decide what the Constitution means. You know, when you look at the federal level, there's no one branch that is supreme, and that's exactly the kind of tug of war that our founders wanted. And this tug of war tracks with the founders' views regarding the nature of man, because after all, man is sinful. So we should not give any one branch of government the final say. That's why instead they wanted to separate the powers. That's a practical application of the viewing man as being sinful, that you're going to want to limit man's powers. So you separate the powers. You don't say, oh, one branch is, you know, gets the final say and you know, sits as king. No. You have this tug of war that's going on between the branches. Now, myth number two is that Supreme Court decisions should be treated as settled law. And, of course, we looked at that. No. Who is the lawmaker in this country? Who makes the laws at the federal level? It's not the Supreme Court. It is the Congress. And so what can Congress do if courts start acting like lawmakers? Well, Chief Justice John Marshall, the one who handed down Marbury versus Madison, said they can reverse a legal opinion from the courts or issued by the courts. So There's many things that can be done. And the scriptures say there was a tribe in Israel, the tribe of Issachar, that understood the times and knew what Israel should do. That's how we need to be as American citizens. We need to understand the times and know what America needs to do. And that's one reason why it's so important for you guys to diligently study your government homework and to read the Constitution and to know what it says. Okay? Now, any questions on what we've talked about so far? Because I still have our special presentation to get to. But first, I wanted to ask you if there's any questions. And while you're thinking of any questions that you have, or maybe a question that I missed that you already might have put above, so if I missed it, you can re-ask it. But I have a question for you in the meantime, before we get to the special Thanksgiving presentation. Given that the Constitution says what the supreme law is, given that the Constitution does not give the final say to the Supreme Court, why are people so willing to give the Supreme Court the final say? What do you think? I mean, the Constitution in Article 6 lists the three things that are the supreme law of the land. Supreme Court decisions are not listed there. They don't get the final say. So why are people so willing in our country today to want to give the Supreme Court the final say? What do you think? One might be that they're ignorant of the Constitution. That is true, and certainly with polls of the American public, probably a lot of that is ignorance because that's what they're taught. Okay, they don't care. Bias, sure, because the talkers. Okay, now here we get to the more sinister answer, because the talkers want change, and they want to drown out the quiet ones who disagree or don't know any better. Ben, you hit it out of the park. Think about this. There is bring about change in our country. If change is needed, there is an Amendment 5 which allows for amending the Constitution. However, that takes a lot of work. I mean, you've got to get super majorities in the states to agree to it. One way to do it is you get the Congress to propose the amendments, and then 3/4 of the states have to approve the amendment. I mean, it takes a lot of work. So think about this. Is it easier to do that, or is it easier to change the country's direction with 5 votes on the Supreme Court rather than going state by state to amend the Constitution? Let's say you're in favor of abortion, and abortion is illegal in most states. Is it easier to pass a constitutional amendment, or is it easier just to get 5 votes on the Supreme Court? See, that's why people love perpetuating this lie, because it's people that want change. In 2008, in November of 2000, I think it was November, it may have been October, but now President Obama said we are 5 days away from fundamentally transforming this nation. Okay, it was 5 days until Election Day. See, there are people who want to fundamentally transform this country, and by goodness, he's done a good job of trying to transform the country. But that's the thing. If you want to bring about transformation because you have a totally different mindset, I mean, his is actually more consistent with a Marxist mindset. But if you want to fundamentally transform the country, how do you do that? Boy, it takes a whole lot of work to have to work throughout all the states. Much easier just to get your people on the Supreme Court, and then with 5 votes, you can just start ignoring the Constitution, and the courts can start making laws, quote unquote. That's why this is such an important, what we talked about today is so important. It's important to have the constitutional view, the view from our founding fathers, and not what's being taught today. All right, so just as a final that's what you have on that's your homework again for next week. Now, we are not done yet. We have about 20 minutes left. So with the remainder of the time, what I want to do is, because this is our last class before Thanksgiving, I wanted to share with you the lesson the pilgrims learned in regard to some things that we have talked about in class. You remember that we studied Marxism, right? You all know who Karl Marx was, the father of communism. You'll remember how, and I was just referring to this, how Obama and actually Biden have spouted Marxist views talking about redistribution. By the way, speaking of redistribution, I hope you guys went and checked out that video. Remember a few weeks ago I showed you this cartoon in the lower right-hand corner. Pretty funny cartoon. Well, a comedian named Steven Crowder did a great job illustrating this to teach kids how immoral it is for the government to take money from those who have more and to redistribute it to those who have less. And so he went to a trunk or treat and set up a hidden camera in his car. If you want to watch this, you can search Steven Crowder and Halloween on YouTube. It is hysterical. Because kids would come up to him and he would tell kids, "Hey, you've got too much candy. You need to share." And then he would like reach in and grab their candy and give it to the kid next to him. And kids were crying. One kid said, "Mom, you need to call the police." And at the end of the video, Crowder looks into the video camera and he says, "These kids get it. They understand that they should be able to keep the stuff that they earn." I mean, not that trick-or-treating is really earning stuff, right? But, they got the point. It's a hysterical video. And the cartoon on the screen basically gets the same point across. Well, the pilgrims struggled with the ill effects of redistribution as well. Thankfully, they learned their lesson and discarded it. But I want to have you guys read the story that the pilgrims learned. And this is a story that actually comes from William Bradford, who was the first governor of the colony. It comes from his writings, but it's as told by Rush Limbaugh. Every Thanksgiving, right before, on the Wednesday before, during the 2 o'clock hour Eastern time, he reads this passage from his book, which basically is building off of, or basically explaining in modern language, explaining what William Bradford talks about with regard to their experiment with communism. Okay, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to start at the top of my participant list, and I'm just going to go right down. So I'm going to start with Jenna, go to William, Christina, Adelaide, Grace, Taylor, Adrian, Ella, Jessica, Hannah, Clara, Nicholas. We'll see how far we get. Maybe not everybody will be able to read. If you absolutely can't read, let me know. If you're sick or your thing's not working. But otherwise, so I'll start with Jenna, and I'll probably just have you read, a couple slides, 2 or 3 slides, and then we'll go to the next person. So Jenna, hello, how are you?
Can you hear me?
Yes, although you're loud and scratchy. So I would say move away from your microphone just a bit. And let's do another sound check. Oh, wait a minute. We lost it. There we go. All right. Try it.
Is that better? Is that a little better? No?
It's still kind of loud and scratchy, although I turned you down over here, so I'm okay. Can you back up the mic a little, or is it a headset mic?
It's just my laptop.
It's just on your laptop? Okay,
Yeah.
The way you said that was better. So maybe if you just kind of keep your voice down and don't talk loud, because your mic is picking you up really well. All right, why don't you go ahead and start, and I'll let you go a couple slides, and then we'll go to William.
Okay. On August 1st, 1620, the Mayflower set sail. It carried a total of 102 passengers, including 40 pilgrims, led by William Bradford. On the journey, Bradford set up an agreement, a contract that established just and equal laws for all the members of the new community, irrespective of their religious beliefs. Where did the revolutionary ideas expressed in the Mayflower Compact come from?
All right, thank you, Jenna. Now we'll go to William for the answer. Hey, William, how you doing? William, wait, are we starting to hear something?
What did you say?
William?
Sorry.
There we go. William, is that you?
Yeah.
All right. Hey, we can hear you, and we got pretty good sound, too. All right, so the question was, where did they get the revolutionary ideas expressed in the Mayflower Compact? Go ahead and take it away, William, from the top of the slide.
From the Bible, and this is what's not taught. This is what's left out of most public school education. The Pilgrims were a people completely steeped in the lessons of the Old and New Testaments. They looked to the ancient Israelites for their examples, and because of their biblical precedents set forth in Scripture, they never doubted that their experiment would work. But this was no pleasure cruise, friends. The journey to the New World was a long and arduous one, and when the Pilgrims landed in New England in November, they found, according to Bradford's detailed journal, a cold, barren, desolate wilderness. There were no friends to greet them, he wrote. There were no houses to shelter them. There were no inns where they could refresh themselves, and the sacrifice they had made for freedom was just beginning. During the first winter, half the Pilgrims, including Bradford's own wife, died of either starvation, sickness, or exposure. When spring finally came, Indians taught the settlers how to plant corn, fish for cod, and skin beavers for coats. Life improved for the Pilgrims, but they did not yet prosper. This is important to understand because this is where modern American history lessons often end. Thanksgiving is actually explained in some textbooks as a holiday for which the Pilgrims gave thanks to the Indians for saving their lives, rather than as a devout expression of gratitude grounded in the tradition of both the Old and New Testaments.
Super. Thank you, William. Great job. Let's see. We'll skip Christina because we already had her speak earlier. So Adelaide, sorry. We'll give you the next one. Let's do a quick sound check.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yeah, very good. Not scratchy. So go ahead.
Cool.
Take it away.
Okay. Here's the part that has been omitted. The original contract the Pilgrims had entered into with their merchant sponsors in London called for everything they produced to go into a common store, and each member of the community was entitled to one common share. All of the land they cleared and the houses they built belonged to the community as well. They were collectivists. Now, Bradford, who had become the new governor of the colony, recognized that this form of collectivism was as costly and destructive to the Pilgrims as that first harsh winter which had taken so many lives. He decided to take bold action. Bradford assigned a plot of land to each family to work and manage, thus turning loose the power of the marketplace. Long before Karl Marx was even born, the Pilgrims had discovered and experimented with what could only be described as socialism. And what happened? It didn't work. Surprise, surprise, huh? What Bradford and his community found was that the most creative and industrious people had no incentive to work any harder than anyone else, unless they could utilize the power of personal motivation. But while most of the rest of the world has been experimenting with socialism for well over 100 years, trying to refine it, perfect it, and reinvent it, the Pilgrims decided early on to scrap it permanently. What Bradford wrote about this social experiment should be in every school child's history lesson every kid gets. If it were, we might prevent much needless suffering in the future. Here's what he wrote. The experience that we had in this common course and condition, or communism, tried sundry years, that by taking away property and bringing community into a commonwealth would make them happy and flourishing, as if they were wiser than God, Bradford wrote.
All right. Thank you very much. Let's see, we'll skip Grace because Grace was sick and the computer had a virus, I believe. Wink, wink. Taylor. Let's see if we can get Taylor to read next. Let's do a sound check.
Guys hear me?
Yes. And sounds good too. Why don't you take it away? I'll let you go a few slides.
This community, so far as was founded to breed much confusion and discontent, and retard employment that went to their benefit and comfort. For young that were most able and fit for labor and service did repine, express dissent, that spend their time and strength to work for other men and children without any recompense. That was thought in.
All right, Taylor. I've muted you. It sounds we got a bad connection on your part. Sounds like your sound is going in and out. But basically, on this slide, and you guys were reading along, you could see that basically what they found was that when they had a communistic system, basically the same people were lazy. You know, as you can see from the picture, right? Because if people weren't going to profit from their own work, then why work hard? You know, if everything they did was the produce was going to be taken away and redistributed, why would you want to work hard? All right, let's try Adrian. Hey, Adrian. Yo, Adrian.
I've never heard that one before.
Oh, I bet you haven't. All right. Go ahead and read this for us, if you would.
Do you hear what he was saying, ladies and gentlemen? The Pilgrims found that people could not be expected to do their best work without incentives. So what did Bradford's community try next? They unharnessed the power of good old free enterprise by invoking the undergirding capitalistic principle of private property. Every family was assigned its own plot of land to work and permitted to market its own crops and products. And what was the result? This had very good success, wrote Bradford, for it made all hands industrious, so as much more corn was planted than otherwise would have been. Bradford doesn't sound like much of a big government liberal, does he? Is it possible that supply-side goodness gracious, is it possible that supply-side economics could have existed before the 1980s? In no time, the Pilgrims found they had more food than they could eat themselves, so they set up trading posts and exchanged goods with the Indians. The profits allowed them to pay off their debts to the merchants in London, and the success and prosperity of the Plymouth settlement attracted more Europeans and began what became known as the Great Puritan Migration. So the Pilgrims decided to thank God for all of their good fortune, and that's Thanksgiving.
All right, thanks, Adrian, and I'll take this last one. And read George Washington's first Thanksgiving address and count the number of times God is mentioned and how many times he is thanked. None of this is taught today. He's talking about the public schools, of course. It should be. So have a happy Thanksgiving, folks. You deserve it. Do what you can to be happy, and especially do what you can to be thankful, because in this country you have more reasons than you've ever stopped to consider. So that's the type of thing that he will say this coming Wednesday, actually, the day before Thanksgiving. So if you happen to catch it, you'll hear him reading this section out of his book and explaining it. How many of you knew that part of the Pilgrim Thanksgiving story? How many of you knew that had happened? Yeah, I mean, he's absolutely right in that it's not something that is commonly taught, but when you read Bradford's journal, it is exactly what happened. And about the shift in government. Yeah. So, well, good for y'all if you had learned that before. But now you guys know the rest of the story. how they went from famine to plenty. Yes, I mean, don't take God out of the equation, uh, but God also gets a lot of the credit because they discarded an ungodly system and implemented something that was consistent with God's word. Because nowhere does God justify stealing. I mean, he doesn't. Thou shalt not steal, and that's basically what communism is because no matter how hard you work, it's taken from you and then redistributed. So, is there a link to read up on this more? If you want, you're talking about the Thanksgiving story. I would recommend one of two things. Either one, read it in the original. If you can get a copy of, it's called Of Plymouth Plantation by William Bradford. That would, of course, be the best. If you can read it in, the guy who was actually there. Or I believe it's Rush Limbaugh's book, See, I Told You So, which is a kind of funny title, where he has this account. Otherwise, I think you could probably just Google, if you were to Google pilgrims, let's see, what would be a keyword? I think it was common course and condition was the way Bradford, yeah, the experience that we had in this common course and condition. So if you were to to Google that, pilgrims, Bradford, common course and condition, you'll probably bring up plenty of stories on it. I own Of Plymouth Plantation along with the Federalist and Anti-Federalist papers and the wow. So you've got like the whole shebang. All right. Well, any questions then about that story or what we were? I mean, this obviously didn't necessarily have anything to do with what we were talking about today in class in terms of the Supreme Court, other than, however, this did apply obviously to much of the government material that we've been talking about. And I thought you'd like hearing about this since it's right before Thanksgiving. Anyway, we are out of time. So, questions? No questions? All right, guys. Well, y'all have a fantastic, yes, Thanksgiving. We will see you back 2 weeks from today. And hopefully you'll be alert and not extra sleepy from all that tryptophan in the turkey. Take care, everybody. Bye-bye.